Alright, so now that I've put out a couple of videos, I'm getting a better idea of how I want to present information on this channel. So today I want to more or less update my introduction video with a much better one. The reason I started doing guitar videos and also songwriting videos, but I'm going to stick to guitar videos for the purpose of this, it's because of a trend that I've noticed on like the similar channels that are already available right now. I feel like a majority of these channels, they aim to show rather than teach. And it's kind of similar to how cooking channels act like a visual and audio aid to a recipe. In the case of guitar videos, the recipe is tablature. So the method that a typical guitar channel employs helps build muscle memory, and it works on the physical aspects of playing guitar, but they don't really teach the fundamental aspects of musicianship. And what this ends up doing is it forces you to become dependent on these resources, and you really have to look towards these channels and use guitar tablature solely to work on becoming a better musician, which ultimately isn't a great way of building your musical skills. Now, I certainly started playing guitar this way. Everybody starts out using these resources because they're very helpful, but at a certain point you really want to start branching off and relying on yourself to learn how to play and to become a better musician, as opposed to these other resources. I'm going to use another pretty outlandish analogy here to back myself up. For anyone who's ever taken a foreign language class and they've studied for a vocab test, you know what that's like. You get a sheet of words, and through classical conditioning, you essentially create word associations between these unknown words with the translations in the language that you know. If you drill yourself hard enough, you could probably get an A on the test, but like a couple of years down the road, you're going to forget everything you ever learned about that language. So, in this case where you're just memorizing tabs, and you're memorizing what someone has shown you how to play on the guitar, it's not something that'll really stick with you through time. To really learn a language, you have to adapt your way of thinking towards that language. Now, sometimes you're going to hear people say theory is the language of music. If you really think about it, grammar is sort of the theory of language. In this case, music is its own language, and theory is the grammar that sort of tries to organize the rules that have developed over time. One of the things that frustrates me the most as sort of a spectator is when a beginner asks how they can, ask what they can do to become a better musician. Someone is inevitably always going to respond and tell them to memorize scales and modes, which I think is terrible advice. Memorizing things is rarely ever a good way of learning something, but I'm going to put an asterisk by this for a reason. I want you to keep this in your mind. In the case of learning a language or learning music, it's like handing someone a Russian dictionary when that person doesn't even know the Cyrillic alphabet, and telling them to learn the language by reading the dictionary. The person's going to see like a funny looking word like Dorian or Locrian, and they're going to understand like the translation, which in our case would be a fretboard diagram. And through conditioning, and association, they can match the two together. But in reality, they really haven't learned anything about what that word means. It's too big of a leap, really, to tell a beginner to learn their scales. So my advice instead, the first step in becoming a better musician, and I took 2 years of Russian, so I'm familiar with this myself, it is to learn the alphabet. The best way of becoming a better musician is through ear training, and for beginners, the specific form of ear training that they want to do is interval training, not the workout routines. The fundamental unit of music is the interval, which is sort of like a relative distance between two notes. In Western music, it's the spacing between the 12 tones, how we have 12 frets from the root note to the octave. Now, earlier I mentioned how memorization isn't a good technique of learning, but this is where the asterisk comes in. Intervals are such a fundamental unit that the only real way to learn them is to memorize them. It's the same way a kid, like a small child, learns the alphabet by memorizing the ABC song. At that point, when they're just learning how to speak coherently, the ABC song is basically gibberish. But it's definitely a necessary step, because over time you need to have that knowledge in order to start spelling words, in our case chords, and later on fully understanding how to use the language. So for the actual lesson here today, the easiest way to memorize intervals, and again we're talking about 12 tones in Western music, that's what I'm going to show, is to use mnemonics, which is, for our case, is just common intervals that you might already know from just time. The basic assumption here is that everybody knows the major scale. It's your do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So the rest of the work is really just filling the holes in between. To make it easier for you, I will show the mnemonics that I used to learn these intervals, taught by my high school theory teacher. So, a classic Western scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, contains 8 notes, 7 unique notes, and then the last note is the octave. So how do you fit 12 tones into 7 note scales? The way is through a specific naming convention. It's like a numbering system. So you have do, re, which is a second because it's 1 to 2. Do, re, mi, mi is the third relative to 1. Do, re, mi, fa, fa is the fourth, so it's the fifth, la is the sixth, ti the seventh, and the octave is 8. And depending on what scale or mode you use, the interval is going to be different. And the way we differentiate is through the words minor, major, augmented, and diminished. Now, there are some cases where different names will mean the same notes. In that case, the words are enharmonic, which means the words have the same physical frequency, but they have functional differences. I'm not going to go into diminished and augmented, or I'm not really going to go into scales or chords in this video or future lessons because that's a bit beyond me. But for the intervals, but I'm just going to go ahead and show the intervals that I know. So, the very, very basic interval is obviously the root. It's the same note. It doesn't need to be explained. The next interval is the minor second. This is the classic Jaws theme. The next note, the major second. It's just standard do, re, which everybody should know. The farther you get along, the harder it is to keep track of the note, so I'm going to use different examples for the other intervals, but in this case, just use do, re. The next interval is the minor third. To me, this is the first 2 notes of Stairway to Heaven. The interval after that is the major third. To anyone who knows the old doorbell jingle, that's the first 2 notes of that jingle. The next interval is the perfect fourth. It's Here Comes the Bride. The interval after that is the tritone. Now this is the case where the tritone really goes by 2 enharmonic names. It's either the augmented fourth or the diminished fifth. There is no minor or major with the fourth and the fifth. There's a reason I don't really know the reason why. I can't explain the reason for that convention. It's just the way it is. For anyone who, for the metalheads out there, who I assume is the majority of people watching this channel, this is your Black Sabbath. That is an octave, and then the note after that, your tritone. Very important note in heavy metal. The note after that is the perfect fifth. It is more or less the most boring interval, honestly more boring than an octave in my opinion. It is the basis of the power chord. The best analogy that I can come up with, the best mnemonic that I can come up with is, for anyone who's a fan of Lord of the Rings, it is the Riders of Rohan horn call. It's a very Roman sounding. The next interval is the minor 6, sorry. This is the point where it starts to get hard to memorize these intervals for the beginners. So this is really one of the things that you have to drill really hard. And I'll give a resource for learning intervals later. This is the part of the ragtime song, The Entertainer, that we all know. The next interval is the major 6, which is the NBC theme, if I hopefully play this correctly. The last two intervals are, I don't have good mnemonics for these two. If anyone can come up with a good one, please let me know. That'd be pretty important. The way I've done it is I'm going to skip the minor 7th and go to the major 7th. The major 7th is the biggest interval, by definition, the biggest interval you get before you get to the octave. It's a half note away. It's called the leading tone in major scale. When you talk about, that's another. It's known as the leading tone because it leads into your octave. It sort of resolves this like suspended sound. The minor 7th would then be the interval that's really big, but not the major 7. So the way I've really learned it is just by default. This interval, the minor 7th, is the one interval that I don't know, and in that sense, I know this interval. So, please practice these intervals. Train your ears so that you know these intervals really well. The best resource online, if it still exists, is a site called Music Theory, one word, musictheory.net. And there are places where you can do interval training, chord training, scale and mode training, and it's definitely a great place for you to become better and better. Once you learn your intervals, you can start playing around, learning how to build chords, learning how scales are built, understanding the definition of scales, and really learning how to use something rather than memorizing how to use it. So that's pretty much the wrap up for this channel. My hope is that people will start engaging themselves and pushing themselves to learn more about becoming a better musician rather than being satisfied with just knowing how to play something through muscle memory. So thanks for watching.